Chris, you are muted.
Thank you, Lauren. I was just going off. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm sure other folks will join during this preamble, but I appreciate everyone taking their time and spending their lunch with us today. But not for our presenters who are on the West Coast, so they've probably just finished eating breakfast. Thanks for coming today to the Team Science Skill Series put on by the Georgia CTSA. Just a couple quick housekeeping activities. We're super excited about, of course, today's session and our future workshops. Tom O'Neill, for those of you who were scheduled to come to his talk, we've rescheduled that for because of hurricane reasons for October 25th. Betsy Rowland will be giving a talk on collaboration planning on the 15th. In December, we'll transition to Shannon Marlowe, who will be giving a skill series talk on team communication. And lastly, Sean Burke from the University of Central Florida will wrap everything up on leadership on December 13th. Just a quick plug for following the sessions. We put these on every year, and we love to get your feedback. It helps us plan for the next year. So please fill out the evaluation forms that we have for you. And we are also asking you to fill out, if you want to, information about potentially signing up for a consultation session with our experts. So we will be sending out information about that at the end. And would love if everyone could provide their feedback. But on to today's session, we'll be talking with David Fuentes and Jeremy Hugh from Portland and Washington, respectively. They'll be giving a presentation on incorporating debriefs to foster team development and dynamics. So I will hand it over to you all, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having us. You all should be able to see my screen.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the value of using debrief to help foster team development. So a little bit about us. My name's Jeremy Hughes. I'm the Associate Dean for Professional Pharmacy Education and an Associate Professor at the University of Washington School of Pharmacy. David, did you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm David Fuentes. I'm also an Associate Dean at University of Portland, focusing on academic affairs and variety of student services. I also serve as a strategic advisor to our Director of Leadership Studies, essentially a chief of staff to that individual running our campus-wide leadership division and course series. So I'm happy to be here with you all today.
So our learning objectives are, we want to talk about the pros and cons of using a debrief culture in all aspects of work and in organizations. We want to analyze help you to have some tools to analyze your current team dynamics and to assess the viability of integrating debrief into some of your routine practices. And then we also want you to evaluate your current practices in integrating team debriefs into routine organizational gatherings and meetings. So we want to talk a little bit about our why. And it's really, we feel that debriefing can be used to help improve culture, help maximize team interactions, trust building, team dynamics, and results. And the idea of debriefs are fairly common across professions. So like in theater and performance, sometimes they'll do a post-mortem. Kind of similarly in healthcare backgrounds, debriefs after a surgery, debriefs after events, as well as military and lots of other areas. Really to kind of not only focus on quality improvement, but to really focus on keeping the team together and that overall team spirit. David, was there anything for the why that you wanted to add?
No, I think you've covered it really well. I think this is going to be a great way to find a way to look at how debriefing is going to help you solidify your teams and also have a healthy conversation about what things need to start, stop, and continue, as we'll talk about in a bit.
So there's lots of different elements that you can include in debriefing. And we just kind of did a quick internet search to come up with this short list. But a lot of them are kind of related to how was the communication? Did everybody understand what their job was, their role, their position? How was the awareness of the event maintained? Did everybody know the overall plan? Did we follow the plan? How was the workload distributed? Was it fair? Did one person do all the work? Did one person know what was going on and the other folks didn't know what was going on? Was there a process for asking for help? Did everything turn out well, or were there errors or issues? And what resources were available or weren't available? What went well, what didn't go well? What's something that could be improved on or done differently next time?
And one thing to think about here with that list too is that as you're looking at those questions, you'll see that they're closed-ended questions. So you can do this in any manner, and these are not magical questions where it has to be these specific questions, but this gives you a sense of how are you gathering ongoing information and feedback from your team. And if the answer to some of these is a simple yes or no, then thinking about how to explore those even further and having a meeting very much like you see in the visual, where everybody is sitting together, everybody is facing each other. There's really no indication of hierarchy, if possible, even though there really is one. And then how do you have that open conversation that builds on the data that you're gathering from your team here and there?
So part of the debrief is having a good relationship between the team and feeling that people have psychological safety where they can share the things that didn't go well and not just try and hide them or ignore them, but to share them so that we can learn and grow. And part of that is just how do we have our interaction set up? Do we have a briefing where we come together as a team beforehand? People can share ideas, concerns prior to the event. Do we have a huddle partway through or immediately after? And then do we have a structured time to debrief? One of the things that I think can be really helpful is when you kind of have a routine debrief built in, a routine huddle built in, so people kind of know what to expect. It's kind of just a regular part of what's happening is, okay, before the event happens, we know that we're all going to have a huddle to get together to talk through it. We also know that the debrief is going to happen afterwards. So it's not a surprise to anybody on the team that we're asking how things are going. It's just something that they're used to and expecting. Of course, if people weren't aware that a debrief was going to happen and then all of a sudden you called them together, people might have a little bit of anxiety surrounding that that piece. So it's just great to like let people know what's happening beforehand. So we wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the cognitive and affective attributes of a healthy debrief. One of these I actually pulled from a debrief session relative to the Blue Angels, so the Navy's fighter pilot group. And we really liked the aspects that they have. So it's kind of having that respect, which allows for that safe environment or psychological safety where people are going to share, where we listen to each other. We treat people with similar levels of respect regardless of their position. And we're able to really value everybody's contributions and ideas in the debrief. The other thing that's really helpful, especially if you're the one facilitating, is to check your ego. It's actually really important for everybody, regardless if you're the one facilitating or not. Again, it kind of goes back to that mutual respect for people at different levels in the organization. The other thing that's necessary is really being willing to share the good, the bad, the ugly, so that everybody's aware of that happening. One of the ways that you can really kind of demonstrate that if you are the facilitator is by sharing first, and being a little bit vulnerable and demonstrating something that you noticed that you were involved in, taking some ownership or accountability. And that's really what the next one is. And admitting, what your part was in anything that didn't go well, but also recognizing what you could do next time and have that personal ownership in it. And then the other thing is really demonstrating engagement in the process. So with the Blue Angels, they actually have a phrase that they add when they do a debrief, and they always kind of start and finish their kind of report out with a glad to be here statement. So they actually are like, I'm glad to be here. And then they, say what happened, and then they finish, and I'm glad to be here. Sometimes those rituals or routine can really just help bring the team together. But also, like I said, it's kind of that expectation of people know what to expect, so there's not surprises. So kind of building on that, that concept from the Blue Angels, there's a process called the Diamond Performance Framework. And you can see with those 4 pyramids or 4 triangles that it really kind of starts with that belief or commitment to the team. I kind of use that example of the glad to be here, but it's that commitment to the team, demonstrating that you're listening to everybody. You're not on your devices, you're not multitasking, you're actually engaged in the process. And then as part of that process beforehand is having the brief, making sure everybody's on the same page, making sure people feel like they know what's going on beforehand. And when people know what to expect, that's really where trust goes. They know what to expect, how people are going to behave, how they're going to interact, and how they're going to think. And then after the event, they know to expect that debrief. They know that it's coming. And again, it's not a surprise for them. So there's lots of different approaches to debriefing, but I think it's helpful if you use a consistent approach, whichever approach that you choose to use. A simple approach is a start, stop, and continue. So after an event, what are the things that we want to do new next time? So what do we want to start? So essentially things that could be areas for improvement. Stop, of course, is what are the things we don't want to do next time? What are the things that we want to make sure don't happen? And then continue is kind of focusing on those positive things that we already did, and making sure that we include them next time. It's important to have that continue aspect because sometimes, well, it's important to celebrate the successes that you had, but it's also important to document those things that went well. Sometimes we have a negativity bias, or often we have a negativity bias of what didn't go well or what we want next time, but it's also important to focus on that continue because that helps people, helps demonstrate your appreciation for other members on the team and recognize what went well by them. So we talked a little bit about there being lots of different tools for a debrief, and there's also lots of different tools that you can use to help evaluate your team and how it's functioning. One you might be familiar with is Patrick Lencioni's The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And if you go online, you can actually see that a team assessment that focuses on how your team works. And you can see a couple items here on the assessment, like team members are passionate and unguarded in their discussion of issues. Team members call out one another's deficiencies and unproductive behaviors. So the team assessment was really designed for how your team interacts kind of all the time, but we're suggesting that you can also really use it for how your team interacts during a debrief session. So we want to actually take a little bit of time to have you do a little bit of a reflection on how the current team that you work with interacts in a debrief scenario. Anytime you've had a debrief after a major event, whether it's a celebration or a ceremonial event, or whether it was a major activity like putting together a conference or putting together a workshop, anything like that. So we're actually going to use that same 5 dysfunctions of a team. There's, I believe, 15 different items. We're just going to have you kind of think on these first 7. So we're going to give you a couple minutes to kind of look through these and think of how did last time you had a debrief or talked about an event after the fact, how did your team interact? So we'll give you just a couple minutes here. I encourage you to either kind of score it on a piece of paper or on a Word document, just kind of reflect through and think on that. The scores are kind of actually less important overall for right now, but it's just to kind of get us thinking. So now that we got you thinking a little bit, we want to do just kind of a quick little debrief with us right now of what were some things that kind of came to mind? What were some like feelings or thoughts that you had? And you're welcome to either unmute yourself or type in the chat or both. We're happy for either one. So I can get us kind of just started with the chatting a little bit. So I'm pretty new at my organization. I just shifted over here about 2 months ago. And I think we're still focused on kind of building the trust. So there's a little bit of people might be struggling just a little bit to admit weaknesses and mistakes because they're unsure kind of how the new team dynamic is with me here.
can share briefly. I'm thinking about a couple of projects at this point. I think about the and challenging is to have meetings that are, I guess, worth having. I think people, when they show up fully and honestly, are great members of the team, but I think sometimes it feels like pulling teeth to get people to show up when we're all so busy. And so figuring out how to make those meetings compelling, useful, and that's not exactly the debrief topic, but that's what resonated for me in this list.
Thank you so much, Jen. One of the things that I think about as I hear you describe that is that a lot of the work that goes into the 5 dysfunctions of a team assessment is almost like you need to have a functional, great team so that you can get the most out of your debriefs, because it does make your debrief a lot richer if you're able to, for example, as you mentioned, really bring in that complete self in terms of who you are into the workplace in a very healthy way. And the more folks are able to see each other as teammates and not as adversaries or not competing, then the better their debriefs will be. So what you're mentioning is actually very much in line with our topic here, because one of the things to do is, in what way can you really identify the team, identify whether or not you need to be a team, because not everybody does need to be a team. And once you have identified the team, then how do you work to really enable them to bring that kind of person who they are, that you mentioned at their best, into every meeting? And sometimes it is about the team, and sometimes it's also about their own personal challenges they might be facing, maybe even outside of work, that are now bleeding into the conversation or into how they interact with others. But I really enjoyed your comment, Jen. Thank you for that contribution. I'm also seeing that there's some chat here. Let me see here. From Sam. And Sam, you mentioned that a small team, everyone is pretty willing to discuss issues, but you think that they don't understand how everyone fits together yet. And several of you all are also new. Sam, I wanted to invite you to expand on that if you wish, or is that pretty much what you wanted to share, so that we can then really think about your contribution here?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, so yeah, we're in a small lab here, and so I was thinking about our debriefings as weekly lab meetings. And so about a third of the team, I would say, are brand new to the lab, and so we're still trying to figure out who we work across both in basic sciences, but also in clinical samples, and so figuring out who's doing the clinical collections and when stuff should be there. But I don't know. I guess it feels like it's a little expected that you'd have some miscommunications and misunderstandings at the beginning. But I guess if you have any, I assume we're going to talk about how to improve that and work on that more quickly, maybe.
Yes, and I think one of the tools is already at your fingertips with this team assessment. And then you don't have to get everyone to actually take the assessment, but you can just look at those 15 items and you can just talk about, how generally are we doing in this area, and then get everyone's perspective on that, because there's a great deal of definition that needs to happen sometimes, even for things like, what does it mean to be on time? And even with new people, there might be some cultural aspect where even in the previous organization, time was very much a suggestion. And you kind of start the meeting around that time. But then for others in a different work culture or work environment, then it's really, if you're not 5 minutes early, you're late. And then what does that demonstrate to everybody in terms of respect and in terms of work ethic? And so there's a great deal of opportunity to even define some of those very, very taken for granted terms and items that we often think about. And being on time is only one of them. And I can say that one safely because I think that I've been late. I've been someone who's been waiting for people as well. And so I've been on both sides of that equation. But there are so many others that have to do with, what does it mean to have a meeting full of brainstorming? What does it mean to have a meeting that is not as structured as most meetings? And what preferences do people have for those? And is it oppressive to have an agenda, for example, or is it free flowing to not come in with an agenda? So I think a lot of those questions you can start to ask each other based off of these specific 5 dysfunctions items. And maybe you don't score each other because it feels weird to give yourself a score, but maybe you just talk about, well, how could we have more productive conversations, and what does it mean to have an unproductive conversation? And maybe the word unguarded sounds funny to everybody, and they want to talk about, well, what does make me feel guarded? And when people question what I'm doing with the why question, like, why are you doing that? I feel like I'm on edge, or I feel like I'm being attacked. I know it's not what you were intending, but that's what it comes across to me. And sometimes even having that conversation is very useful, especially in small teams. When the small team, because I know small teams comes up later on in the comments. And so I think having that small team just gives you a better sense of having those conversations, and you can have them rather quickly and rapidly to bring everybody's perspectives in. But I want to pause right there and see what reactions come up for you, Sam, or for anybody else hearing that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely resonate with the idea of being able to more maybe easily and quickly like form those understandings you're talking about with a small team. Um, uh, I guess I also think about, like, I'm one of the underlings on the team, and I'm here because eventually I will be a leader, but not the leader yet. And so, like, I love I love the idea of, like, kind of like getting back to the basics on what are, like, even just very baseline taken for granted expectations and stuff like that. So, yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, the part about expectations is interesting because we often don't make our expectations clear and explicit. We also just assume that our colleagues will have the same things that in terms of values and importance that we put on certain things. And we don't do it on purpose. We just inherently bring all that into the workplace because we are human beings. And I appreciate that contribution, Sam. Samir, you brought up a very different lens where there is that sense of not knowing what peers are working on, and just being spread, really focusing on, if you were to work at a larger organization, sometimes there is not a lot of crosstalk that happens organically, and it doesn't happen day to day, and maybe it happens periodically, and sometimes even either constructed through the structure or by chance. And that's why this idea of being spread out can be very physically and emotionally separated, have that feeling. So I really resonate with that and appreciate your contribution, Samir. Did you want to expand on that in any way?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm involved with a group at Emory where we engaged in a lot of clinical research trials. And it started off with that we were a smaller group when I first started, and then as the group grew, we ran a physical space to have offices adjacent to each other to communicate and stuff. And so we ended up having to be separated, finding different buildings to house offices, and then clinical responsibilities also grew at the same time, and people were off campus at different times doing various different things, and it just became harder to understand what people were doing, and they have their priorities as well. So that, I think that physical thing contributed, really felt like we weren't knowing what our peers were working on. And then as a result of that physical separation, we weren't able to establish an emotional connection to what they were working on and being able to support them, and vice versa. So that's why I put that on there.
That's wonderful. I appreciate that contribution because one of the things that you outlined was really important well, you outlined several important things, but one thing that we'll address today a little bit more is how do you be intentional about creating that environment where maybe if it's not normal or customary to get together frequently, then how do you build that into the system so that you can have those connection points and you can meet and discuss what is needed and also where people can help. And those meetings can very much take the form of what we showed you earlier with a brief meeting before the meeting or a debrief towards the end of a meeting, where you're coming together to discuss either preparing each other for the conversation or talking about the conversation that just happened. And what is needed. And those can be very brief stand-up meetings and stand-up huddles and conversations like what Jeremy showed you earlier in that visual. But sometimes even saying we're going to have a daily huddle for 5 minutes and we're going to talk about 2 things. And the 2 things are, here's what I'm working on very quickly, and here's where I need help very quickly. And maybe you could even give it a time frame of, this is my major 1 project this week. This is where I need the most help this week. And then that way folks can start to negotiate and look at needs and look at how people can help one another throughout the week. And that might be something to start with, but I appreciate that contribution, Samir. Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of about developing the routine and expectations, and really like building in that intentionality can be really helpful. So I'm going to move us forward. These are just the additional questions that are in Lencioni's debrief. We're not going to spend time on them right now, but when they share the slides out with you, you have them, or you can actually just find it online pretty easily. And there's a way to score it, but like we said, we actually find value in not scoring it, but just using the questions as some general prompts. So we want to give you a little bit more of an example of using a start, stop, continue model as of a debrief in action. And kind of based on where we were at and what we were just most recently discussing is kind of reflecting a little bit, what does your team need to start, stop, and continue? It might be related to intentionality. It might be related to those like having clear expectations or revisiting expectations. Those were some of the things we kind of talked on. So let's go to a case example.
Yes, and with the case example here, I'm going to give you an example of a university system. And this could really be any kind of system, but we chose a university. And in this scenario, we're looking at always improving university and how they've gathered their campus leaders at various levels to try to work on something together. And the leaders work and oversee in areas related to academic affairs, student support services, human resources, and various other groups that relate to workforce and a variety of connections with external partners. They're currently reviewing the following statistics to find ways to improve their practices and revise their strategic plan within the university. And one thing that they've encountered was that 68% of employees have a retention, or they're able to retain 68% of their employees over the last 3 years. They also have 22% of their employees, faculty in this case, who are on the tenure track. And in tenure track, it's really more of a sense of hierarchy where these individuals have less opportunity for being funneled out of the organization unless something serious happens within their tenure. The other part is a rise in temporary staff and adjunct instructor faculty members. And one thing that this really denotes, especially in the workforce, is you're seeing a lot of new members coming in and out of the organization, especially being temporary. And then there's also this notion of decreasing sections per courses. And this is more of a workload process where for faculty to have their workload, they're given more course sections to teach. And when those course sections get taken away, that is something where now you're looking at having fewer faculty compensation metrics going into each faculty member. So they may be getting paid less in this situation, which now has an impact on their bottom line earnings, depending on their contract. And with this, you're seeing that students, because now there's fewer sections, they're having larger numbers of students in each of their sections. So their workforce has now doubled. And the way this translates over in healthcare is now thinking about ways in which you have a higher census maybe within your unit. And with that higher census, now you're having the same maybe resources, but now you're having to take care of a lot more and having to use the same existing resources, but to provide care and follow up for a greater population by number. So now you're getting that sense of higher workload, lower or maybe similar resources, and now you're getting a lot of different individuals coming and going into the organization. And as you're looking at an organization like this, one thing that we look at is, what do you think might be able to help them in terms of start, stop, continue, and what might be able to help them move forward in terms of being able to debrief and asking themselves some of those powerful questions that they need so that they can not only ensure that they provide the best education, so on your end, so that you know that you're providing the best care, and what would you need to ask yourselves as a team to be able to move forward? And then this brings up the question of, what do you believe that this team needs in order to start, stop, continue, and be successful, whether it's in the academic setting or whether you're facing parallel dynamics and situations in the healthcare setting or your industry? What's on everybody's mind in terms of, as you're looking at a situation like this? And you can feel free to use the chat as well, or simply unmute and just discuss with the group.
So sometimes in a complex situation like this, it's helpful to just look at one aspect at a time. So if we kind of look at faculty and staff retention, or just employee retention, because I think that's something we can appreciate kind of regardless of our field. You know, what are things that we might want to start, stop, and continue to foster retention? I see Sam's comment about measuring key outcomes. So we actually have some actual data around retention, but continuing to make sure that we monitor that and see, has there been a more recent dip? Has there been a change? I like that comment about start asking people why they're leaving. Is there an exit interview process set up? Are there any anonymous surveys? What do those things kind of look like?
Yes, and I would agree. I think that the key outcomes is central. And as you're looking at what it is that everyone can rally behind and everyone can agree to, whether it's patient care quality, whether there is a quality in a process or any kind of practice that's happening and necessary, and whether there is some operational outcome that is something that you can really put up there and say, this is how we know our unit is succeeding. Keeping that as a front and center metric and having that be known to everybody is very critical, because that's something that nobody can argue against and that everybody can see as an outcome. And I like the start as well, because I think you're not going to really understand why people are leaving if you don't ask the questions. And even then, you have to consider the culture of the organization, where if it's a very high trust culture, you're likely going to hear what people what people really think. And if it's a low trust culture, you likely won't. And if you start to find that there are patterns of affect with these exit interviews where people are often feeling emotional, that is also a clear indicator that people are leaving in a way that is either depersonalized or having reached that burnout point in terms of their work at the organization. I also appreciate the dilemmas part. It would be nice to start a seminar series to help us learn more about women.
Looks like maybe David's frozen, at least on my end. I don't know about for other folks. But yeah, it's if we're noticing people are leaving, maybe it's because they don't have that connection with their fellow employees. So it's kind of really looking at, what are some ways that we can foster additional connection, like through a seminar series, through some intentional meetings, intentional events to foster connection. And also I kind of see that comment about the similar topic for debrief. And I think it's kind of recognizing where we're at. So I'm going to continue to move us forward, and then we'll see if David's able to rejoin us. But I think some of the other elements are really related to facilitating debrief and recap. So identifying what are some good strategies for when we want to facilitate debrief. And I think some of the approaches that we really want to go with as we're thinking about that is, what are some things when we're leading groups in general? So a couple of ideas that come to mind that we've already mentioned are related to creating a structured opportunity for debrief, creating shared expectations for what would happen during a debrief, as well as kind of creating an opportunity for us to, oh, it looks like I got a message from David that his internet's disconnected, so he will be trying to rejoin us when he's able to. But kind of really looking at opportunities to, like I said, share first, demonstrate some vulnerability, so that you can get other people to participate and be engaged in the process as well. What are some thoughts from the group on strategies for facilitating a debrief? Based on your experience, what has, if we kind of use that start, stop, continue model, what is something that you want to start doing when you facilitate a debrief? What is something maybe you've done before and you want to not do in the future that you want to stop? And what are some things maybe you're currently doing that are successful that you feel like you could share with the group? So yeah, what are some strategies for facilitating debrief? I'll kind of get us started just a little bit with it. One is when we talked kind of about the huddle, and I know that's something that happens a lot in healthcare environments for like rounding and other things, but is having a standing meeting. So where we're actually like standing up versus sitting down has allowed for us to have like more shorter meetings and efficient meetings, so one person doesn't drone on longer than somebody else. So kind of saying like, okay, we're going to meet for 15 minutes, we're going to stand, we're not going to be in chairs, so that we can really keep to our 15 minutes and not continue onwards. Okay, Sam, I see your comment about having some unstructured discussion time for bringing up any issues. I like that. It's kind of really helping set some expectations for that people can bring something at the last minute, that you don't necessarily need to have it as a agenda at a time. It's just that open piece. Welcome back, David. So kind of really where we're at right now is we're just doing our own start, stop, continue on based on our own personal experiences of running a debrief, things that we thought we want to either continue doing that we've done in the past, things that we might want to start doing that we haven't been doing, and things that we want to potentially stop doing if they were unsuccessful.
That sounds wonderful. And I'm seeing a lot of amazing ideas on the chat. And I really think that idea of being sure that there's a culture of this as a process focused situation. We're not focusing on blame. And we're also not shifting blame. I think that is critical for not being able to, for being able to not focus so much on the who of the situation. Because if you're employing systems thinking, could anyone else have made that same error given those same circumstances, that same team, that same process? And I also am enjoying the conversation here or the chat here about being sure that people are armed with the data that they need to make the best decisions, and being able to know that if I have a challenge with something, I'm bringing in the data, and I'm also letting you all see it and sharing it with you all. That's fantastic for both trust and transparency.
Yeah, I think the other thing kind of related to that, the data and the facts, is really making sure everybody knows what the intended outcomes are. I mean, some outcomes are really obvious, like, you know, we want to improve patient wait times. We want to improve, you know, customer service scores, those kind of things. But what are our primary goals? How do they relate back to team goals? How do they relate back to, you know, the organization's goals overall as well?
I think that is critical because it comes back to one of the initial comments about identifying your outcomes and identifying outcomes that really nobody can argue with, because those are so inherently connected to your mission and to the reason why you exist as a department or as a unit. Other thoughts or ideas, other comments on debriefing, on our debriefing approaches? It may also be useful to think about in what way there might be some challenge with incorporating this into your culture. And I'll share with you experiences that I've had where sometimes this was met with a great deal of skepticism because it, again, was seen as something that would take you away from the work. And individuals sometimes will say that, you know, we have too much work to do to be involved with this. And in what way does that continue to build even more work into their queue, because that's really what they're focused on, is just getting the things done, and sometimes missing opportunities where there might be some collaboration and where a process might be made a bit simpler or more streamlined, thereby decreasing their work overall. So that was something that I've encountered, is that sometimes there's skepticism there, and there is an argument that time and work are going to get in the way of us doing this debrief, yet not doing the debrief sometimes assures that we keep that time dedicated to all that work when it might be streamlined. So that's just one area that I found. And also coming in as a new leader, sometimes for a unit, sometimes there is a level of, you know, maybe there's no trust built yet, and they see the debrief as a way of maybe trying to having this new leader trying to exert control over the group, when in reality that's not what it is. But then how do you build the relationships with individuals to get them to really see that what you're bringing is something that might help their overall operations, and trying to find a way to communicate what's in it for them to be able to engage in these debriefing sessions.
One of the things I can share at my current organization, they've had a good process for quality improvement where after an activity or an event, they'll send out a survey to capture ideas. But an opportunity kind of arose around actually having a debrief as a team. So kind of hearing other people's thoughts and ideas. So while they were gathering really useful debrief style information, they weren't really hearing other people's ideas. They weren't hearing it specifically like, in their own voice, or seeing the expressions on their face, or seeing how they connected with each other. They were just seeing kind of an aggregate data of, you know, what to start, stop, continue, versus hearing it from people and their own impressions. Which once we kind of started doing it, even just as a short, like 15 minutes together, is people would kind of be like, oh yeah, that reminds me of XYZ. So it allowed for more of a rich conversation than just capturing via a survey. So we're nearing the end of our time here. Yeah, and I see Kathy's comment in the chat. I definitely agree. Sometimes people are like, okay, it's another meeting, and I don't need another meeting, but it's really being focused on, you know, what's the purpose of a meeting? It's not just a meeting for meeting's sake or a debrief for debrief's sake, but it's actually like, here's the intended focus, here's how we're following up on it, and then really using the information the next time you have a similar type activity taking place, so that people can kind of see that full circle assessment process taking place, and that their ideas were incorporated.
Yes, and I think the utility is so important here, because the fact that Kathy, in your example, that the meetings have become an acceptable standard, I think is great in terms of the environment and what's been created at your organization, because there are folks that sometimes don't see it as a standard, and they don't leverage it because they don't see it as useful. And there's that idea too of, well, if we're having these debriefs and feedback comes up, as the leader, are you integrating the feedback that you're hearing? And if you do, you'll find that people do find a way to have these debriefs. They're going to want to engage in them, and they're going to keep providing you with really great information. So congratulations that it is an acceptable standard within your organization and within your environment.
I think kind of my concluding take-home thoughts are really to have that shared set of expectations with your group, and to try and use a consistent model. It doesn't have to be start, stop, continue, but as long as like everybody's kind of using the same process and knows what to expect, that's really helpful. And then that other kind of takeaway of being able to use like team assessments, like the 5 dysfunctions, can really apply to debriefs and other aspects of, there's already great questions that are out there, but how can we use them to look at aspects of debrief?
And if your organization doesn't use these at this point, one thing to consider is starting with proximity, and starting with whose work is most highly connected with my work. And maybe we have a supervisor together, and maybe they're not really thinking about this yet, but that doesn't stop me from going to my colleague and saying, well, let's see, how do we connect in terms of our operations? And at the same time, do approach your supervisor, and maybe even together, and say, we'd like to have something like this. Do you think it's possible? And they may consider it, just because it's something that's coming from at least 2 members of the team. And if you have a rather large team, then it's that idea of, again, going back and seeing, well, who typically crosses my operations the most, and how do I start to coordinate with them in terms of not only our relationship at work, but also our connections, and how our work can come together and how we can help each other.
Well, thank you all for participating in our discussion today. I think it's really it's great to hear what people are doing in different organizations, and how it sounds like many of us are having similar challenges, but we're able to kind of hear what other folks are doing.
Yes, thank you, David and Jeremy, for that great session today. I have a last slide about our upcoming ones, but for some reason it's not displaying. So, but we'd like to make sure to hear your feedback. We'll send a link, hopefully in the chat, and through emails. And if you want the consulting, sign up for the consulting session too. Be sure to fill out information on that link. It's the same link, both the evaluation and the consulting session information. Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't get it to, I had it full screen and I couldn't get it to pop up. I don't know why. So yes, thank you again. Remember, we have one next week as well. But for now, let's thank David and Jeremy for spending their time with us. And thanks again. And we'll see everyone soon. Take care.